The film examines the issue of the conditions that lead to terrorism. To do this, it employs Germany's past, which I would like to emphasize is only an example. It's important to me that the film isn't interpreted as being solely about German fascism, but that it more generally deals with the roots of all kinds of terrorism, whether politically right, politically left, or religious. Those are words from director Michael Haneke on his 2009 film, The White Ribbon. Seeing Faces of Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer. And each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and today we're talking about The White Ribbon. Quick synopsis of the film is: strange events happen in a small village in the north of Germany during the years before World War I, which seem to be ritual punishment. Who is responsible? The film stars Suzanne Lothar as the midwife, Rainer Bach as the doctor, Maria Victoria Dragas as Clara, Christian Friedel as the schoolteacher, Leone Benesch as Eva, Ulrich Tucker as the Baron, and Ursina Lardi as the Baroness. It's written by Michael Haneke, cinematography by Christian Berger, directed by Michael Haneke, edited by Monica Willi, and costumes by Moidel Bikel. Today my guest is Nathan Cowles. And this is the second time on the show. First episode we did together is for the Rohmer series. We did A Tale of Summer. I would say slightly different vibe this time, but two great directors. And when I thought of doing a Haneke series, you were top of mind, actually for both of those series, but I was like, there's no way I can't do. There's a few directors where I'm like, no, Nathan has to come on. So first and foremost, thank you so much for coming back on. I really appreciate it.
Of course, no worries. Very happy to discuss the man himself. Very excited.
I'm curious as to when you got into his work, what drew you to his work, and what makes you want to seek out his other films outside of the one we're talking about today.
Well, I think like a lot of people who are kind of in my age demographic who are interested in film, for some reason, Haneke is always kind of like in that very auteur, like you have to see his movies sort of thing. His name has been pretty prominent in the art house film spectrum for a very long time. So I think everybody kind of gravitates towards him just because of how other people respond to him. So that's definitely how I got into it. And I mean, the first Criterion I ever bought was Funny Games. So, and that was when I was 15. So that was very much like a revolutionary sort of moment for me, because it definitely changed my perception on how you show violence or how you display, I don't even know if I want to call it like action, but just depravity and just complete misanthropy in a movie. How are you able to really hone that in and create something out of it without feeling gratuitous? It was very, very great seeing that. And it eventually just led me into delving more into his filmography. Probably the most interesting thing I can say about me delving back and like kind of looking into his filmography is that, and I'm not happy about this, but I actually swiped a copy of Code Unknown from a Barnes and Noble, and I am still I'm not proud of it, but I got to take it home and watch it. And I was like, okay, this is great. I'm going to keep this. And I never paid for it, but it's proudly sitting on my shelf, and it kind of looks at me with guilt every time. But yeah, he's one of my favorites. I'm continuing to still kind of get to his deep catalog, but the bass stuff I've pretty much covered. So this is a great introduction if anybody's never seen a Haneke film before.
I agree. Also, I feel like he would be proud of you for swiping it. It feels like he would be like, let's not give the big corporations money. I love that intro, and it's cool to see younger people getting into his work. I feel like I get the question a lot of, what made you go to film school? How did you get into wanting to explore more films? And I could never pinpoint what it was until I was doing this series. And I remembered, I feel like I tell the story a lot, but my high school best friend and I used to try and one up each other with horror films and see who could show the most messed up one. And she was like, okay, I got one for you and let me a copy of Funny Games. And then from there on, I then the next year enrolled into film school. And I was like, that's definitely where it started. So I am forever indebted to him. And it was inevitable to do a series on him and for it to be like a nice Halloween, I think, October series is like, yeah, let's all just sit in our depression for a bit. So I'm excited to delve into it. And we can get into the first segment, which is just our personal thoughts on the film. So this film came out in 2009. So we're a little bit later. I mean, at this rate, 2009 is, what is it, 15 years ago?
Yep.
Which is
Yep.
wild to say, but it is later in his filmography because he's up there in age, so he's starting to wane down. He's only done a couple more since then, but it's later in his filmography. Do you want to just talk about what your thoughts are on the film? What drew you to the White Ribbon?
It's fucking awesome. It's a great
Mhm.
movie. It is incredible. I pretty much found out about it from the fact that it won the Palm, and this was kind of during
Mhm.
the stage of my life where I was looking through all the Palm d'Or winners and kind of going through the list and watching them all. And I watched this one, I believe, before Amour, so I was kind
Mhm.
of going from jumping from his first to the second, but it floored me the first time and I hadn't seen it for a couple other years. So the reason I chose it was just because I knew it was the one I had to rewatch. Because I think aside from maybe Caché, this is the most complex and most I guess if you want to call it just non wrapped up or just the one with the
Mhm.
most loose ends aside from Caché. But this one just it seeps in and it doesn't really it gives you the answers, but it doesn't really give you everything, and you're stuck just sitting and contemplating it.
Yep.
And there's really no way for you to truly know what's going on. And I enjoy that sort of aspect with pretty much all of his movies, but most specifically this and Caché because of that continuing lingering of just how you're going to just wallow in this. And the more you find out and the more you think about it, the more sad and depressed and completely nihilistic you're going to feel. And I think that's an incredible feat for any director to kind of make, especially if they are really taking that complete depression route. If they're going to really delve deeper into that, the best way to go about with it is to allow it to linger in that person's mind instead of just being straight depression throughout the entire thing. It's
Mhm.
lingering for those rest of the days, allowing you to think about everything and allowing you, again, wallow in everything. So, yeah, it's great. I don't really know what else drew me into it aside from the palm and the fact that Haneke's name was attached to it. It was just,
Mhm.
I didn't look up anything beforehand. I didn't really know anything about it. I didn't know what was going on. I just knew I wanted to watch it because of the fact that prior to watching it, I had seen some other Haneke films and I knew this would probably be something that I would enjoy. But I assume that you have a little bit more of a relation to it since I can only imagine that yours is a little bit more interesting than mine.
No, I mean, probably not really. I was going to say, oddly enough, this was a first time watch for me. I had not seen it yet,
Great.
and I don't know why. Sometimes where you really like a director, and there's always that one movie that escapes you that you think you've seen, and then you realize you haven't. So part of the other reason why I suggested as one of the options was this, hoping you would pick it, was because I mean, I would have watched it anyway, but I was super glad to have watched it. And we both watch a lot of movies, and I don't know, I don't want to sound like a dickhead, but sometimes it takes a lot for a movie to be like, wow, that's a film. And this is one of those where I was like, this is insane filmmaking. This is insane writing and pacing. And I just couldn't believe every scene I was watching was just so perfectly crafted. And I love kind of how he's playing on, at this rate, he knows North American audiences are watching his films and playing on the fact that we love a mystery. I know I do. And the whole time you're kind of being like, okay, who did it? Who did it? And he is never going to give you a clear answer because that's who he is. And he's playing on that. And it doesn't matter. Like the whole point of this is that it doesn't really matter who did it. It's showing that people of all sorts are capable of terrible acts. And that's what he loves to explore, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I'm kind of curious as to there's a couple of things I want to get your opinion on. One is the use of black and white in this because he hasn't done that in a feature, and the use of narration, which he also hasn't done. I don't know if you had any thoughts on those two aspects being used and if you felt they fit for this or if they didn't and why.
Well, I will say that this is easily, I think, his best looking movie, and I don't really think it's close. Despite the fact that maybe narrative, I would probably enjoy the soft spot I have for funny games or the more emotional complexity of something like Amour, which I would probably say
Mhm.
that story wise I'm a little bit more gravitated towards. But in terms of composition, lighting, and framing, it's pretty unmatched. I don't really see any competitors with it. And aside from the fact that, this does take place prior to World War One, and just having the
Mhm.
black and white fit for that reason being in an old period piece, I don't really see as to why it should have been in color, especially also the fact that this is such a hopeless, gray, and cold environment, anyways, that if you went ahead and you put it in color, it would feel it would feel too bright. It would just feel out of place. So having it in black and white, yes, I think it's a fantastic decision. The narration bit you actually just mentioned, I actually kind of kicking myself at the fact that I didn't realize that in other movies he has never done narration, because you're totally right. But I think also it never drew me away from anything. Looking back on it, it felt so natural because
Mhm.
it really is kind of looking back at this time prior to World War One and seeing how this generation grew up to be the fascist Nazi generation, anyways, and kind of
Mhm.
taking this opportunity to look back on it in a bit of a critical light and being like, well, this is how it happened. This is what this country did. This is what these parents did. This is what's going on. And by having that narration and placing it in that future perspective and looking back on the past, it helped sort of reaffirm the ideas that I think Haneke is trying to make anyways. And if you didn't have that narration, granted, it would still be a fantastic movie, but
Mhm.
it does definitely add that next layer to the theme that I don't think it would have otherwise. And I think that it's a great addition. And again, it does not take away from anything that the movie has to say or anything the movie does. It's perfectly placed, which is something that you could really say about his other movies, just in general, of how
Mhm.
meticulous he is about making sure that these things happen and these things don't happen, which is something that I'll get into in a second with another thing that he does in all of his movies, but how it's especially worked here. But I would
Yeah.
imagine that you're a fan of this cinematography too, because I don't know how you can't be.
I obviously am a big cinematography head, and this just is gorgeous. Christian Berger, who he has worked with before, but obviously his bread and butter must be black and white because it just looks beautiful. And I'm glad that you mentioned like the framing too. Like everything is just so perfectly placed. I'm sure Hanukkah could have done this in color, but he's too smart. Like he's smarter than us, to be honest. Like he knows what he's doing. And he's also super smart that he would never use narration unless he felt it was necessary for this story. Because I think he's not someone who likes to hold the audience's hand. He likes to do the opposite, to be honest. He likes to keep them at arm's length and be like, you need to figure this out. So he's not doing it to dumb things down. I think he's doing it to add a layer. I was reading a few articles about it and people talking about the narration kind of like a narrator who was there, but explicitly says, I don't have all the facts. I can tell you what I know. Knowing that off the bat, you're like, okay, this is someone's side of the story, but this is not the full story. And you're never going to know the full story. So I appreciate the use of it. I remember when it first started, I was like, oh, I was not expecting narration because I've never heard that in one of his movies. But then I didn't, it just like disappeared in my mind. I just didn't think about it as it was going on. And this is a longer movie. I feel like some of his movies range from like 90 to 2 hours, and this is a bit longer, but to me, it flew by. I think I was just on the edge of my seat the whole time. It just felt like it started and then it ended. And I don't know that I was breathing in between, but so intense. One of the last things I want to talk about, and I'll ask you in terms of last personal thoughts, was he loves to tap into the fear that most of us have. I'm not going to say everyone, because there's some people out there who don't care, but most of us have a fear of seeing violence against children, especially on film. And we see this in a lot of his films. And he kind of taps into this is something that happens on a day-to-day basis, unfortunately. And we're not often faced with it in our media, other than the news. And it's very much prevalent here. How do you feel like it dealt with here versus, say, his other films that he's tackled this subject in?
Yeah, kind of going back to Funny Games, a quick spoiler for
Mm-hmm.
Funny Games if you haven't seen it. But the death of the son really like floored me. The first time I watched the movie, I was just like, holy shit, I can't believe I just saw this.
Yeah.
And it definitely, seeing that at like 15, when I was very much just trying to work my way through like film and trying to, discover a little bit more foreign movies and a little bit more of the else aspect of filmmaking, it was definitely very jarring. But I guess what it did was I've noticed, and this is, I mean, it's definitely a big thing with American cinema anyways. When you have children, you're supposed to, you really cannot do anything bad to them. You
Yeah.
can't show them getting hurt. If you're going to show them getting hurt, they either got to be okay, or if they're going to
Mm-hmm.
die, you really can't show it on screen. There's definitely that baby aspect that they're going to hold on to when it comes to the audiences. So it's why I have so much respect for his movies in general, when he's very much like, no, I need to show, like, you have to see this, you have to know what's going on, kind of like putting the mirror up and being like, no, like this is happening in
Mm-hmm.
places that are probably not even too far from you either. Like, you cannot escape from these sort of things. Like, these themes and these issues are going to permeate, they're going to be happening, and there's really nothing you can do about it unless you know what's going on. And I think that it's also just taking the audience into his hands and treating them with respect anyways, which is again why in something and like other horror movies that are coming out today, or other just movies in general, where it's kind of inching, it's like, oh, maybe the kid will die, or maybe something bad's going to happen, and they just kind of, they either take it away and they're like, oh no, it's okay, or they're just not going to show anything. Unlike something with Funny Games where you don't really see it, you're kind of just like, you don't see the action, but you're left to sit with the reaction of the mom, or like what's going on with this, where you don't really see what's happening to the I forget his name. I think it's Otto, the kid of the midwife. You don't see what happens to him, but you see the aftermath, and sometimes the aftermath is just even more traumatizing than anything that you could have seen with the actual violence. And that's it's frightening, but it again, treating your audience with such respect that you can't help but just admire his work at that point. And yeah, I think that it's a great sort of accomplishment of his to kind of be able to present it in a way that stays true to his standards of not trying to glorify violence, but also doing it in a way where he's not pushing it aside and not like forcing you to watch anything. He finds a very good median in between and pretty much utilizes that to the best of his abilities.
There's so much that you said that I agree with. Well, I mean, I agree with everything, and the stuff that I want to hold on to that we'll discuss further. Two things: the scene with the midwife's son legit made me cry, and it just made me so sick and sad because, there's always something bad going on in the world. Right now, it's pretty heightened, so it's hard to watch. But I also am glad that you said that he has respect for his audience, because I think a lot of people joke about how he hates his audience. I'm like, I think it's actually the opposite. He has such immense respect and love for the audience that he wants to face them with facts because he wants to treat us all like adults, but he doesn't want to put us through, like, the violence very rarely takes place on screen. And I've been watching all of his movies through this series. There's a lot of violence that happens, but like you're saying, we're seeing the aftermath that is often even more terrifying to watch than seeing someone killed. Because seeing someone killed, we do see it in movies all the time. But then the scene ends, right? The people are continuing on with their lives, or they're running from the danger, as opposed to sitting with the terror of what people have to deal with after these violent acts are done. So yeah, it's a lot. Do you have any other personal thoughts you want to talk about? We're going to still talk about, obviously, the White Ribbon, but anything just on story that you want to chat about before we move to the second segment?
The one thing I will say also, well, at least unless I ramble off onto something else, but the main thing was also the way that he uses music and sound in the movie too, because throughout his entire filmography, he doesn't use music in a very, well, both in a manipulative way, but also as like an exterior sort of force. He uses it interior within the scene to kind of go ahead. For the most part, like I think there are some exceptions, but mainly they're used within the scene to kind of convey that tone while also being played within the scene. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And it's the same case here. Everything from the piano chords that are being played during the tutoring session and how that scene pretty much elevates the scene itself to kind of go ahead and be pushed to another level, I think is absolutely brilliant. But also what caught me off a little bit more on the second watch is just the creaking and the sounds and again, the coldness that the environment really has of just, there's desolation throughout everywhere. There is no semblance of love or of any sort of care being taken from anybody. Everything is so creaky. It's so deteriorated. Nothing is in pristine condition. It's all dying, essentially. It's all being broken down, and it well, not only fitting, but it just adds to such a dour environment. And watching this with a better sound system than I had last time, I was really able to fully incorporate everything that I wanted to get out of that. It's a very subtle choice, but damn, is it really just add to the conversations that they have every now and then. Like, I think the one that really did it was the priest walking around talking to his kids, and you just hear the footsteps and you just hear the creaking of the boards, and it just adds an eerie tone to the scene. It adds so much to it without sacrificing any sort of, without sacrificing, again, like the respect that he would have for the audience. Because a lot of filmmakers, if they really wanted to go ahead and try and make a scene dramatic, or they wanted to make a scene a little bit tense, they would go ahead and rely on a score, or they would use that external source, which is great. Scores are awesome and they can really add to that movie. But I think there is a art to not being forced to put a scene in the hands of a score, and rather within the scene's environment, which is, again, something he does pretty much throughout the entirety of his filmography. But really here, I got a deeper appreciation for it than I think I did on first watch.
That was part of my notes too. Just again, going through his stuff. I don't know that I even fully realized that his lack of use of score in his films, and just having mostly diegetic music, especially here. And it was really apparent here. And I think, again, like you said, score can be very important and very beautiful when used correctly and by someone who actually understands the film, in terms of a composer, instead of trying to manipulate the audience's feelings or emotions, and more so complementing the scene. Here, it would feel weird if there was a score, and especially in certain scenes like the scene that you mentioned. I was thinking of a scene where one of the young sons of the doctor is coming down the stairs looking for his sister in the complete darkness, and he's calling her name, and is going up the stairs and going down the stairs, opening the doors. And because it's so silent and so dark, something. We already know what's going on, unfortunately, with the doctor and his daughter, and the sexual abuse that he's doing towards her. But that scene would have just been so, like, out of touch if there had been music behind this. It just would have felt really gross, I think. So he's smart enough to know no, we don't need anything behind this, because we're not trying to soften the blow here of something that is just super dark.
Yeah, like geez, everybody sucks in this movie for the most part.
Yeah.
Like, you get, like, the occasional I think his name is Otto, or the midwife's not too bad, but like, holy shit, yeah, there's not a really single glimmer of hope throughout the movie. It is so sad, and I love those sorts of movies. So this is, obviously right up my alley. And I think, because we really have talked about the technical aspects, because I don't really think, not that I am at the liberty to like speak pretty much on these themes, but like, they are so well just kind of like taking it in a couple days after and just thinking to yourself about what is being trying to be said, like of what he's trying to say about the aspects of power, the aspects of evil. Where does evil come from? Where are we going wrong with these generations? And what is what is evil? What is authority? And how are we able to take power into our own hands when we are lacking it from other authorities? I think the religious aspect, this is definitely where he kind of gets into the more, like, this is definitely his most religiously, either, I guess, if you want to call it critical or religious explorative sort of film. Very interesting, his dichotomy of authority between how like God and from the pastors and the barons, and who's above who, and how come you have to take power from people below you? How come you can't take power immediately from the top?
Yeah.
Even just that little, I think, like that little thing right there, because I think this movie is very much just best when you're thinking about it on your own time, and then you just kind of come to those realizations, and you're just thinking about it in your own ways and how it attributes to how you're living and how you're going to go about with authority on your own terms. Like, what is so prominent with authority in your life that you're going to attribute it again to like anything far beyond? But oh god, it's so much to handle with these themes, and I love it. I love thinking about them, but I do think that it's so easy to really move beyond its technical effects, and then you just delve into those aspects of film making that he's wanting to tackle through the themes and through the story, and it just it's a mental tax. But man, is it just insane that something like this is so honestly pretty popular amongst people, and how this is one of his most accessible movies too, surprisingly,
which is wild. Yeah,
it's crazy.
That's saying a lot. But all those things, I'm glad that you said we can hold on to those, especially because I do want to get into those a little deeper, especially the power conflicts that he likes to explore. So we'll talk about that. Before we get into those, though, I just wanted to talk about, we'll get into the second segment, the before and after, what he did before the White Ribbon, what he did right after. So what led him to create the White Ribbon. So oddly enough, the film he did right before this was the Funny Games remake, so 2007. His first and only English language film. I have a soft spot for it, but I get people who are just like, well, I like the original more, which is totally fair. I think I love both of them. But first English language film, he created this one specifically because he always wanted the first one to be an English language film for North American audiences. Didn't have the funds, didn't have the name. At this point, he now has the name. He creates this film, shot for shot remake. And then the next film he does, which is The White Ribbon, and it's his first German language film that he had done since the first Funny Games. He had only done French films in between. So before we get into what he did after, I thought it was interesting that, oh my God, I didn't realize he hadn't done a German language film since the first Funny Games, and the one he did right before this was the other Funny Games. Obviously, this has to be a German language film, given the story, but just opinion based. This is not, what I do on the show is just get people's opinions. That's why I have a guest on, as opposed to like, we need to find out why exactly he did this. But what do you think led him to go back to kind of his roots in terms of like going back to his native language after the success he had with French language films and then making his first English language film?
Well, I mean, French people can only be so interesting, when you go ahead and do all that. So I think that in all seriousness, I don't really know. I can't tell you specifically what I think led him to going back to the German language, aside from just the fact that, as you said, the script called for it, and he is talented enough to be able to go from a French film to a German film. He's like, okay, well, you know what? We got it. This one has to be in German. I can't say for sure, though, what it is. Aside from just the story where he's like, I gotta go back to the German language now. Can't fuck with the French anymore. I just can't do it. But his French films are some of his most acclaimed. And then what a cool way of saying that you can also just do great things in two languages in this sort of way. It's nuts.
I agree. I think it's more so him likely maybe having this story might have had in his mind for a long time, but then, was doing all these French films and working with actors he liked working with, and it not making sense, obviously, in a French setting. Maybe just wanting to take some time to go back to his roots a little bit, because then the film he does right after this is Amour, which is in French. So he goes right back. So he's done very little German language films, apart from the couple right before Funny Games. But it's interesting that he feels slightly maybe more comfortable with French language films and studying the people of France more so than German or Austrian people. And I honestly would love to know why that is. Only he can say why, but I do find it interesting, the flip-flopping back and forth and just having this one random German language film after he's been doing, at least a decade of French films. And then with Amour, still studying interpersonal relationships in a more condensed version, because we're essentially watching 2 to 3 people as opposed to like The White Ribbon is a huge cast of people. And sometimes you can get a little overwhelmed with how many characters there are, because especially the children, when kids are young, a lot of them kind of look alike, at least to me, where I was like, okay, which kid is which and who's their parent? I'm sure with multiple rewatches, I would get a
Oh,
clearer
it
vision of it.
becomes very easy. I can tell you that.
Especially, I feel like it must be with like the way they're dressed. I feel like I probably could differentiate them a bit better. But then he goes back to a more condensed version of who he likes to explore. So he goes back and forth. I watched 71 Fragments. That has an insane amount of people, obviously. And then, then you get Funny Games, which is a smaller cast of characters. And then he goes back and forth with how many people he likes to study. And I think he does both very well. But for this segment, I was just trying to put into perspective, where this film falls in the director's filmography and where they were at this point. And at this point, like you said, it won the Palm. He's a huge name, to be honest. Now, I won't say like if you're walking down the street, people are going to know his name, but the film goer, the slightly more serious film goer, he's a name, whether you like his stuff or not.
Oh yeah.
I will say, and I know I will say this in every episode, I hope we're getting at least one more from him, because I know he's up there in age and I think he can give us at least one more.
That's why it's so hard watching Amour, because
Yeah.
you just know that it's such a personal sort of thing for him. And the fact that I am actually very surprised, not to knock him, but the fact that he is still alive, like it's great. I'm super happy about it. But
Yeah.
like with Amour, when you watch it, the fact that was made in 2012 and that is now 12 years ago, it almost it's like, oh geez, it's just getting harder and harder to watch that movie, because it's just gonna happen someday. And the film art house community is going to be in shambles when it finally happens.
I know. And it's like whenever I mean, most of the people I love are either dead or very old. But whenever someone like a Criterion or Mubi will be like, oh, happy birthday. And most of the Haneke pictures are in black and white. And I'm like, uh-oh, they're announcing his death. And like, I'm just like, okay, cool. Thankfully, it's just his birthday. Thanks for, making my heart drop.
Stop putting birthday photos in black and white. Somebody did that for Bong Joon-ho not too long ago.
I know,
for his birthday,
I saw that.
And I was like, oh my God, no. And then I
legit thought he was
birthday.
dead.
I was gonna cry. I was gonna be like, no, there's no way. It's impossible. But yes, to anybody who runs an Instagram account, stop doing it. You're very mean, and it's very concerning when I see a photo in black and white.
I agree. I think we need to take a stand against it, just for everyone's sake. And if you're doing it for engagement, I hate you.
Yeah.
Well, that was a before and after, fairly quick. Segment 3, which we've already talked about. We've already started talking about like trademarks and themes that he likes to explore, just to kind of like expand on it. There's stuff that we've already chatted about, but there's one that I found interesting, because I was reading an interview with him, and I will drop that in the show notes. It was with an Austrian publication. They asked him about his treatment of, or like how he likes to analyze, I guess, children in his films and the way they behave and what happens to them. And he said something really interesting that I guess I do see in his work, but now that I've read him say that, it makes more sense. So he says, this is the only quote I'll read this episode, but he said, I don't believe that children are innocent. children aren't innocent, they're naive and take things as they're told. When you take something literally, it can be dangerous. The world isn't divided into good and evil. I think that is so him, essentially the thesis to this film, especially, but to a lot of his work. I'm wondering how you feel about him saying that.
Fuck children. That is the theme. It has always been his theme. It's kind of funny because on a second rewatch, I actually felt like he was critiquing a little bit more the adults in this manner
Mhm.
because it was more of like the way of parenting and how their upbringing is shaped by how you raise them. And
Yes. Yeah.
the blame really does fall upon you. And obviously, like there is still that very, again, like how we were talking beforehand of how you really treat children as almost like animals in
Hmm.
your movies. You're treating them like we can't have them die because the audience is going to
Yeah.
be too upset. We're going to get bad press for, and nobody's going to go and want to see the movie. So you are going to treat them with the utmost respect. They're going to be great. They're going to be fantastic characters, and you can sneak a bully kid in there every now and then. Maybe there's like that one mean kid, but they're
Hmm.
either gonna not last very long or they're going to be changed and redeemed by the end, which is not the case for real
Yeah.
life. A lot of these kids who are dicks when they are young are still dicks when they're adults. So it's
Hmm.
very brave of Hanukkah to be like, nah, children suck. Like they can be total shitheads. And I think that's awesome. I would say that maybe Caché is where he gets into the most like, okay, children are really can get really fucking evil, sort of thing. I think
Yeah.
like that's where, because I much like Caché and White Ribbon, like a lot of it goes hand in hand with the upbringing and how you raise the kids, their
Mhm.
environment, how they're going to go ahead and take everything. What do they grow up to be? It's very much still prominent there. But again, the blame falls on both ends, not saying that, children are inherently evil. It's saying your children are becoming these deplorable people because of a you raised them, because of the way that you brought them up, and because of the
Yep.
environment you thrust them into and decided this is the best way I'm going to let my kid grow up. So that was, I love that quote. I think that's awesome. I think it's a
Yeah.
great quote. I always knew he was critical of children. I always knew that like that was definitely something from not just his themes, but I think there was another interview I saw where he was kind of shit talking them.
But I think it's exactly what you said. Like he's saying that children are not inherently good or bad because no one is. We're all products of our environment. And what he's showing specifically in this movie is the kids that we know likely did this action. Well, look at their parents. Look at how they're treating them. And I'm sure if you trace it back, how did their parents treat them? Kids are, what he's saying essentially is kids are not innocent because they're a blank slate. There's no innocence to have. And that's what the whole thing about the white ribbon is, this person who wants to cast a white ribbon on these children, but in his mind, they're still not acting pure, even though they're just being children for the most part, except for certain acts that they're doing that doesn't seem. But,
Oh, God.
I see it all the time with certain kids where I'm like, how is it that you're this much of a dick? And then you have to wonder, well, what is going on in their home? Because they didn't just come out of the womb wanting to be a bully. Something's happening to them, or they see it with their family. Kids just are not like that. You evolve into that for some reason. And then you hopefully come out of that, but oftentimes you don't, and you're just that dickhead as an adult. But like the dichotomy of good versus evil, what you mentioned is something that he likes to explore in all of this stuff. And whether it is inherent in a person or not. And I feel like from what we know in his films, he doesn't believe that, but the characters within this film would like to disagree. And I think a lot of people disagree on that. They think that kids are innocent and that you grow into it a certain way, but you only do that because the product of your environment. How do you feel about how it's explored here?
Yeah, I think it's a great kind of subversion of expectation that you would normally expect from, frankly, any type of movie that isn't a art house, black and white sort of movie. Because in movies, there is a very clear establishment for the most part of who is inherently good and who is inherently bad. And
Hmm.
for a lot of the times, you get that backstory and you maybe feel for them a little bit more, but it's not developed in that sort of way. It's more like, okay, well, this they're bad. This is why they're bad. Oh, you can think about it for a little bit more. Okay, well, we're going to go back to the actual good versus bad thing, and we're going to
Mm-hmm.
let you really attach yourself onto the good and really attach yourself onto the bad. Whereas here, the good versus bad, you can't really attach yourself really onto any character for the most part because, well, I mean, I guess you can, but you have to look at it as your flaws maybe in sort of
Mm-hmm.
aspects. And this is a very huge like this would be hyperbolic, I think, for most people about, your inherent flaws. I don't think most people that we know are like going down burning buildings or beating up children or anything like that. I would hope not. But it's kind of looking back and being like, well, in subtle ways, how, like, for parents, how am I raising my children? Did I do something? And
Mm-hmm.
did I bring about like this my child is acting out? Well, how much of this responsibility lies onto me? How much of what is happening is actually my fault? What did I
Mm-hmm.
do wrong? And then you can look at it from the perspective of the children being like, well, though you haven't developed yet, though you haven't created your own real sort of sense of consciousness. Well, I mean, you have the consciousness, but you haven't fully developed like that
Yeah.
adult mind. But why are you acting out in such ways? How come you're taking this sort of power, this lack of power, and putting any sort of rage and anger into someone of less power instead of trying to work ahead to your authority, which is again something that happens in some of his other movies. I think Piano Teacher is another big one that would
Mm-hmm.
be very remiss if it was not talked about here, because that's another power dichotomy sort of thing. What do you do when the power is shifted? What do you do when you don't have that lack of power? How are you to react when something that is somewhat in your control, but just is completely taken out of your way and is
Yeah.
completely torn apart in front of you? How do you respond to this looming figure, this complete lack of power, and how do you deal with it? And it's the same thing here, except I think it's explored just in so many different other facets. And also should be mentioned, not a terrible performance in this movie, I don't think. I think everything,
No.
especially from kids, not a single bad performance in this movie, which just helps again to drive as to why we are so invested in these characters. If a bad performance stuck out and you go to a scene and a kid is flubbing the lines or a kid is just not acting up to par to an adult, it would just seem so, you'd just be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna take this one back. I'm not invested right now. But everything,
Mm-hmm.
you're just like you're fixated because everybody's just bringing forth such a fantastic performance that you just can't help but feel so emotional, despite the fact that you don't like these kids, you don't like these adults, but it's enamoring. And
Yeah.
yeah, just kind of going again, if you look back on his filmography, it's the exact same thing. But
Mm-hmm.
here it's, I think, really because of the sprawling cast developed into so many different branching ways that I just, again, can't get enough of.
I agree. And there's two things that you mentioned that I 100% need to touch upon. I want to talk about the power dynamic for sure and the way it's explored here a little bit further. But before I get into that, just in terms of like, obviously the performances are amazing, but the kids are all phenomenal. And for someone who seems like he has maybe, I don't know if it's a disdain for kids, but I think that he likes to treat them as adults. And he has had several kids in throughout his films, and he's always been able to get such beautiful performances out of them. And I think it's because he probably treats them with more respect than other people who would treat them as lesser than, in quotes, because a lot of people talk down to children, and he's probably like, this, I'm going to talk to you as my equal. And that's how, if you look at something, I know we keep talking about Funny Games, but they're both important films. Those two kids are insane, like their performances, and 71 Fragments had kids in it. And there's kids throughout a lot of his films, whether they're small kids or even teenagers, going into something like Benny's Video. I think the reason why he's able to get these performances of the kids who, I don't know, I didn't even look to see where these other kids are from, if they've done other films, if you just pick them out of nowhere, but that's a talent, because there's a lot of people who I think don't know how to treat children in a film or talk to them. A lot of directors who don't. And there's a few directors out there, like I think of like a DeSica, who is just so good at getting children to put out the best performances in films. So it's wild that, Haneke has obviously something in him that speaks to children in some way, even though you would think that he's just kind of dead inside, but I think he has a huge heart. I notice a lot in his film, he likes to explore power dynamics, obviously, but specifically the abuse of power when it comes to men. I find that he is quite critical of men in different levels of power and the way they use their power. And in this film, we have a lot of heads of the family or people who are important in the community, and the way that they treat their family, their children, is obviously indicative of why these children end up the way that we know they will end up post, credits rolling. We know where these kids are going. How do you feel about the way he explores, men in his films and in this film, and how not all, but when they are abusing their power, why they're doing that, why he likes to explore it?
Yeah, I think again, reverting back to it, the piano teacher is probably the one where you could look at it from that perspective and be like, okay, this is definitely where he's trying to critique it the most. But unlike, I think, a lot of people who kind of go at it from the perspective of just being like surface level, men bad sort of thing,
Mhm.
which I mean, it does not bother me for the most part. Like I know like it upsets the Twitter incels if you just go ahead and do that, but like it's not really a big deal. But it definitely is, if you just keep it at that surface level, it's like, okay, like cool, but why are you really trying to go ahead and say that? Whereas, as I think there is definitely that dynamic that he decides to use, also kind of in funny games, but also, I mean, not funny games, in, okay, funny games, yes, but I was going to say Caché, because Caché kind of has that a little bit too. And I should rewatch that movie. It's a great movie. The power dynamics just kind of like with the critique of men in his movie, just kind of being what is the stereotypical masculine sort of way of dealing with things. And you could even say, like in this movie, I'm going to hit you with the cane. This is how I, as the father, am going to have to go ahead and discipline you. I can't really talk
Yeah.
to you because that's not going to show the proper way of how a father, how a man is supposed to treat their children. It is ingrained, in history that to discipline you, I have to hit you because it's cool. And that's how we look at the men in history, as we are these physical people. Same thing in piano teacher. How come I forget their names in the piano teacher, but how the student, when he is not in that position of power, and how he has to go ahead and thrust himself into that way to go ahead and become the dominant one of the relationship, because that is the societal norm. That is how it's usually supposed to go. And if he's not going to go ahead and have his relationship that way, then he has to force himself into it. So it goes hand in hand with the power dynamic, because in nature, in history, you go ahead and you see men as the powerful, dominant people. And if you're going to go ahead and you're going to critique power, you're going to have to critique the men in power. You're going to have to critique men usually in general, because they are the ones who are in that powerful, dominant relationship with other people. Like they are usually the ones on top. So you have to go ahead and critique it from that aspect and be like, well, we are having these problems with power. If we are having these issues and we don't really know where these dynamics, are stemming from, we have to look at it from the perspective of these people who are having that huge authority. Who are these people throughout history, throughout now? They are men. So it is, again, it's two sides of the same coin, essentially. So if you are going to critique it, you're going to have to critique it the other way.
Exactly.
And yeah, I think that there are other great directors, I think, who tackle it in maybe different ways too, especially like from female perspectives. You can go ahead and kind of be like, okay, well, the power dynamic from somebody who is a woman, this is how it's going. But I think that Haneke is kind of like Rohmer, very much like, this is, I am okay with critiquing my same sex. I am okay with critiquing it because I know that this needs to be said, and you need to have these perspectives, and this is going to be a way for people to listen to it.
I agree because I feel like exactly what you said. It would be essentially boring and one note to just be like, men are bad. What am I supposed to take out of that? Okay, I know that there is that, sort of dynamic there, but what do you as a man have to say about it? And I don't think he ever leaves it up to just that I'm going to make this blanket statement without exploring why certain men are the way they are. And he's not saying, he's never saying it's inherent. All men are like this. He's like, these are why these certain men are like this and why the women are like that for the characters he's creating. But he's never one to just be like, I'm just going to put something out there without some sort of analysis behind it. He's always analyzing his characters. Again, he's just too smart to say something and not have any sort of backup to, support his claim, essentially. So I appreciate that and the way he explores it here and how it relates down to the children who are probably the most important part of this story. Even when they're not on screen, it all kind of leads down to how is this affecting these children? So I appreciate that for sure. Are there some themes that we haven't talked about? Any trademarks of his that you find are apparent in this film that he's been carrying through his filmography?
I mean, we've discussed violence, power, authority, children. I mean, I guess the only other one would be the bourgeoisie, which he kind of does poke fun at a lot in his movies. This one is a little bit
Yes.
more like you have the Baron,
Mm-hmm.
and that's definitely like the power dynamic kind of going hand in hand with it too. But I think it's mostly also in things like Caché and Code Unknown too. Those ones are definitely a little bit more geared at poking fun, or not even poking fun, but just straight up kind of disrespecting the bourgeoisie and
Yeah.
just allowing you to look at them in such a critical light, I think is fantastic. But it's kind of hard to talk about that one because it almost feels like just talking about power and the authority just would
Mm-hmm.
it would be the same thing as talking about the bourgeoisie sort of thing in the white ribbon, because those two are pretty much again just hand in hand with each other with this. So it's kind of pretty much there. We've already stated that. I think that if you want to delve deeper into his bourgeoisie-esque critiques, it would be Code Unknown, because it also goes into the themes of racism, and it goes into the themes
Mm-hmm.
of xenophobia and that sort of stuff. And that's something that I don't think he explores too much in his other movies, but it is pretty well developed in Code Unknown. So if that is one that you want to go ahead and check out, I would highly recommend it. That, and of course, Caché has that too. Both of
Mm-hmm.
those are definitely prominent in that. But as terms of other underlying themes, I don't really think that there's anything that's truly missed, especially like from the big ones that need to be
Mm-hmm.
talked about. Because I mean, you could delve off and be like, oh, the aspects of sex, and you could talk about the aspects
Mm-hmm.
of like religion, that sort of stuff. But again, it all comes back together into the aspects of power, and
Yeah.
it falls under that umbrella. So it's kind of easy just be like, okay, same with the xenophobia, and same with the racism.
Mm-hmm.
It all comes back together. So we've gone this entire time without talking about Seventh Continent. I'm so upset too. But yes, that's a great one about the bourgeoisie if you want to talk about that too. But I'll let you continue.
I know. I am doing an episode on that one for sure. So there will be for the audience more on that, but that also is a great comment. But so is Funny Games in
Oh
terms
yeah.
of, I think we've already spoken a lot about it, but like to, simplify it essentially, I think he knows that the average audience kind of likes to see rich people fail. And why do we like that? And why it's more acceptable to watch when it's a rich person versus a poor person. And that's an interesting topic to explore because I think he also kind of is like, yeah, well, it should maybe not that these things should happen to them, but rare that they get penalized essentially for anything. So he's not afraid to tackle anything essentially, is what we're saying. So I think we did a good job at covering, especially the themes that come up in this that are apparent in his filmography, and just our thoughts on the film, essentially. But we can move to the very, very last segment, which is end credits, and talk about a double bill choice. Now, admittedly, it's kind of hard to want, depending on who you are, you might not want to do anything for the rest of the day after you watch The White Ribbon. But if you're like us, where you're like, okay, cool, I'm fueled to now watch more film, what film or films would you pair this one with?
The one that actually sticks out for some reason, and actually kind of goes hand in hand with some of the themes that Haneke does, is Martha by Fassbinder.
Oh my
I
God.
think I think that is a very good double billing, but not necessarily in the way that I think like the White Ribbon, especially, and Martha have the most consistent of not only motifs and themes, but more so just Haneke's films in general.
Mhm.
Martha actually feels like a movie he probably could have made if it had not been made prior, because it definitely delves into those themes of the relationships of power, of authority. What do we do when we lack that authority? And this one is done in a different way, where the authority has such a prominent aspect where there's a helplessness rather than a outright reversal of authority on somebody of a weaker power sort of thing. It's just
Yeah.
wallowing and like just watching somebody suffer. And I think that if you are in a mood to, sit down, hate yourself for a little bit, and question just why you're doing it to you, it's a great time. I would recommend it. Most Fassbender movies you could probably double bill with this for the most part.
Yeah.
And of course, if you want to double bill it with a Bresson, though everybody knows, I think for the most part, if you follow it, that Haneke was incredibly influenced by Bresson anyways. So
Hmm.
you want to double bill this with Balthazar, I mean, you're gonna have a terrible night, but like, go ahead.
Yeah.
It's gonna be
My
gonna be
God.
fun.
Yeah, those are both great choices. Obviously, I'm a huge Martha head. It's weird to like to watch these type of movies, even though you're like, I hate everything that's happening, but it's so well done that I go revisit over and over again. I would endorse both of those double bills for sure. I think I went for some reason I was just had Bergman on the mind, which I often do, but I thought of two of his films and kind of one that's more along the avenue that you went of if you just are like, okay, cool. I just kind of want to feel like trash today. Let's do that. And one that's does wrap it up in a nicer bow in the way that Bergman often kind of does. But the first one, the more depressing one, you could double bill it with Winterlight, especially if you're kind of tapping into the more religious stuff. And like that ending, you're left in a pit of despair. There's no nice ending there. And you're just like, oh, okay, so everyone's miserable and everyone hates their lives. Okay, cool. And the same with White Ribbon. But if you're like, okay, I need a little bit of a happier ending, and let's just say you don't have the time to watch the TV version. Let's watch the movie version. You could do Fanny and Alexander, which also explores the idea of kids, also the religious part, but the abuse of power and the way children behave there, except Bergman is nowhere near as dark as Haneke could ever be. He does have hope for kids, and I feel like he probably thinks the children are innocent, and that's why there's a happy ending for them in the end. He would never have anything bad happen to a child in his films ever, the way Haneke would. So if you want those two greats who are exploring films, same sort of themes, but the way they navigate it and seeing their personality shine through these characters, that would be interesting too, I think.
Ray, I can never knock a Bergman. He's great. So if you're gonna double bill Bergman with anything, I don't really think I would have any issue with it. I don't think there's a single film I could think of where I wouldn't be like, okay, let's double bill a Bergman with it and just feel like,
Yeah.
nah, yeah, that doesn't work. It's such a such a good little palate cleanser or beginner for anything. So
Hmm.
yes, and
I
obviously
agree.
fantastic.
I think you'd probably, I don't know if you'd want to start or end with the Bergman, depending on, where you are in your day or in your life and how much despair you can take. But
I want to feel like shit forever. So it's just going to be winter lights all day.
Usually that's my go-to. And I'm like, oh, okay, why am I watching all these depressing movies? It's like for some reason they make me feel human. So that's why I gravitate towards them. But I am so glad that we had this conversation. I thought it was amazing. I thought you had so many great things to say. So I'm so grateful that you came on. I really appreciate it, Nathan. Hope to have you on again. I hope that people take what you said and watch more of his films, because this one is obviously really well known, but you've mentioned a ton of his films to watch. So I hope that they do that.
Yes, for anybody who hasn't ever seen a Michel Haneke film, this is a great entry point, fantastic entry point. I think probably this and Caché, I would say, are the two best entry points. And then maybe like Funny Games is also up there. And then if you really are just feeling it, move on to Seventh Continent, 71 Fragments, and Benny's Video. And if you're still up for anything, watch Amour, and then you'll be even more sad, and then finish it off with Code Unknown, at least from what I've seen. I'm very excited to watch Happy End. His style, it is a uncompromisingly beautiful style, so I just can't get enough of it.
I agree. Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia and Ronnie, with intro music by Lamont Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And stay tuned for our next episode on the Seventh Continent. Watch more movies and see you next time.